methods were introduced in the Eton clothing factories. On Bay Street there were buildings filled with clothing factories that Eton's in the early years used to produce most of their own garments, men, ladies and so on. Well, what happened? Oddly enough, the manager of the clothing division for Eton's was a Jew. I forget his name at the moment. But the immigrant Jews looked upon him as an Eton man. You know, he wasn't one of theirs. He was an Eton man, but he was in charge of the whole thing for Eton's. Oh yes, his name was Lubelski. Now, in the clothing factory, this branch, men's clothing, quite a few of the tailors were English and Scottish Jews. They were excellent hand tailors. You wouldn't know that. You wouldn't believe there were Scottish Jews who came here very early, and the East European Jews. One of the changes they wanted to make was to give the men tailors who did handwork certain operations that the finishers, which was usually a woman's operation, did. That would have meant the loss of jobs for women. The men decided they weren't going to take those extra jobs, even though they'd be paid extra for it. And the slogan was, this is interesting, we will not take the morsel of bread from the mouths of our sisters. In Yiddish, wir wollen nicht nehmen den Bissen Brot von unserer Schwester. Sisters, they call it. And really, it's touching. Even now, when I'm telling it, well, I don't know how many times I get sort of worked up.
We don't hear that too much nowadays.
No. So Lebelsky said, or his people, this new system is coming into force. And he gave a date. They said they won't do it. He said, if you won't do it, you will be fired. And the day came, and the job was given to the men, and they refused to do it. So they were told that they're all fired. So they refused to leave the plant. It was also the first sit-down strike in our country, I think. But
this is Joe Salsberg. This will be Rule 2.
To myself. So, but you know, these people, their hearts were in the right place. Their minds too, because what they did was logical, proper, and right. But they had no experience in union work. When they said they were fired, but they refused to leave, and they sat there. But they didn't know that if you want to have a successful sit-down, as the auto workers learned in the 30s, you stay there. So at night they left. They had to go home and came back in the morning, only not to be admitted into the factories. So they began picketing. And after some stormy experiences, I understand, they decided to extend the picket to Eaton's store. The store which to them was almost second home. And they began picketing Eaton's store. One woman, whom I knew later, was on that picket line, I'm told. And somehow an elderly Jew with a beard tried to enter Eaton's store. He wanted to buy something. And I was told that she was such an evil character. She grabbed him by the beard and pulled him away. Where are you going? This is a strike, you see. Poor fellow, he may not have known it was a strike, but whatever. But she did it that way. She was nicknamed by some of her co-workers the Cossack. There's a very unpleasant continuation of that woman's story. Years later, her husband became an employer, and I, totally linked with the labor movement, came and tried to organize her husband's factory. She stood there with an umbrella in her hand, trying to chase us away. But that's part of an ongoing history.
Of force.
That's right. Character. So you see, there was there was a recognition of women's rights, there's no question, in the unions particularly. The early unions, garment workers.
Too bad they lost that impetus. It's coming back now.
Well, you see, there were sociological changes taking place, which we can hardly go into now, but there are reasons for that. But the dressmakers section of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union here and elsewhere was predominantly of women workers, and they were militant. They led strikes. They fought like heck on picket lines. You had to in those days. Women also played a role, let's say, in the Jewish community. The union sentiment was so strong that all Jewish bread bakeries were obliged to put a union label on every loaf of bread from the Bakers' Union. And for a while, in order to enforce this, the women were the main activists in checking if they went into a restaurant or a store and there was no label on the bread. They made a near riot, and of course the storekeeper of the restaurant, the restaurateur, would never have the loaves again. But of course the bakery industry, the Jewish bakery industry, was organized 100% when the non-Jewish wasn't. It was the mainstay of the International Bakers Union here. But the women did that. They pulled a strike when the price of bread went up. So I'm told. I don't remember that myself. Vaguely, let's say I do recall, but vaguely. They went on strike because the price of bread went up. And you know, a loaf was 5 cents.
But that was a lot of money.
A bagel was a penny. But there was a strike. And there were some militant women who went around. And if they found bread, in those days the baker driver would leave the bread at the door in the morning. And they poured, so I was told. And I believe it, because I was told by people who did it. They poured bits of coal oil on the bread and ran. You see, Jewish women, for instance, I know, that was in later years.
Now, all these women you've been talking about are generally
Jewish women.
They were much more militant than the other women.
They had a strike against the butchers at one time because the price of meat went up. And that strike I have a reasonably good recollection of. If a woman came out with a bundle of meat, usually the meat was wrapped in newspapers, they would, if they could, grab the bundle and throw the meat on the ground, on the sidewalk.